is currently some very loud construction going on outside the front of my house. The washing machine is on in the kitchen, the heating is firing up the boiler in the back bedroom, and my friend keeps partying directly down the center like the year is 1999 and I'm a member of the boy band A1. So if you hear any background noise in this video or you see anything untoward going on up here, for the sake of my sanity, which honestly is holding on by a thread, just pretend nothing happened and we'll all just like move along. So all of that aside, I'm here to talk to you guys about the 7 books that I read in January. January was a very good reading month for me quality-wise because everything I read aside from one book, which I think off the top of my head percentage-wise is 85% maybe? No, it's slightly more than that. I don't know, like 87% of the books that I read I gave 4 stars to, which is great. And then I only had one book that wasn't a 4-star, which was a 3. However, I did not do well in terms of the quantity that I read. Reading probably less than I read for the entirety of last year, like in any given month. But I do think that that is because if you guys watched the first episode of Shove It or Scrap It for 2025, which is episode 12, you will know that I DNF'd 4 books, and some of those I read like a considerable amount. Like one I got halfway through, which was 200 pages before I DNF'd, and for the purpose of the wrap-up stats, I only count pages in books that I actually finished. I have spoken in the last couple of years about how I can't seem to catch a break. Like my average rating is consistently dropping and I don't feel like I'm enjoying anything that I read. So I feel like after my January performance, maybe the answer is to just DNF things immediately when they're not enjoyable, which may result in a much higher average rating as we had last month. And of course, because as if my day was not going badly enough, I just realized that one of the books that I've been holding and was holding in the thumbnail of this video is not even one that I read in January. So yay. But getting into those stats, in the month of January, I read a total of 2,876 pages across 7 books, breaking down to an average of 93 pages per day. For the star ratings, of course, I had 6 4-star reads and 1 3-star, breaking down to an average of 3.86 stars per book, which to be honest is probably the best average rating that I've had in a very long time. For the demographics, I read 2 young adult books, 1 new adult and 4 adult. For the formats, I read 6 standardly formatted novels and 1 ebook. For the genres, we had a pretty normal mix for me. There was 3 fantasy, 2 romance, 1 fantasy romance and 1 mystery. And finally, for the places where I sourced all of the books that I read, all 7 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2025, which honestly in the first month of the year is actually not all that difficult. But getting into my thoughts, everything pretty much is going to be positive this month, which is wild for me. But the first book that I read was Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. Now this one is by a very beloved romance author, so going into it I did have some kind of idea that I was going to enjoy this, or at least I was hopeful, which is interesting because the synopsis of this is not something that I typically would be drawn to, because it is following a woman who is in her late 30s, who is from like an affluential family. She's from a family of surgeons. She's an emergency room doctor at a hospital that her family have always worked at. And she is not as ambitious as the rest of her family. She doesn't want to be a surgeon. She doesn't want to follow in their footsteps. She's just getting out of an abusive relationship. One day, I think she's on her way back from a funeral and she stops at this small town where she meets the love interest, Daniel, who is 10 years younger than her. He's not rich like her family are. He has like a generational family home that he runs as a B&B, but he lives very humbly. He's a carpenter, and our main female character Alexis kind of finds out that he is everything that she wants in her life. However, their lives are just so different and she has so many familial expectations that they're never actually going to be able to make a relationship work. So it's safe to say that I love this. This is probably one of my favorite books of the month, although if I'm being honest, I couldn't tell you what my actual favorite book that I read in January was. Like I said, Abby Jimenez is a well-loved author, so I thought it could be something that I really enjoy, but I was still taken aback by how much I loved this because very early on I was very invested in this relationship, which is interesting as well because this is not a slow burn, which is my particular favorite. Like this novel starts off with them meeting in a bar that is in this like little town where Daniel lives. They end up hooking up, they have a one-night stand, and from that moment on, like throughout the novel, they are constantly drawn to each other and it's always romantic in nature. Like Like they never have a period where they're just friends and nothing romantic is going on. Like they're constantly coming back together romantically throughout the course of this book, where typically in romances I like to see the main characters grow together gradually and then maybe actually get together at the end of this novel. So this was very different for me in a variety of ways. But aside from just generally really rooting for the romance, loving the tension between them and the humor in this book, I really loved how this book talked about abuse in various ways. Alexis is coming out of an abusive relationship, but on top of that, this book deals with parental abuse and also different types of it, because both Daniel and Alexis don't have great parents, but in very different ways. We see elements of parental neglect in here. We definitely see a lot of emotional and psychological abuse. While I did appreciate all elements of abuse that were represented in here and the way that they were handled, I do feel like I was particularly drawn to Daniel's situation with his mother because it's something that I feel rang a little bit true to me. And I was a little bit disappointed in this book how it went more into Alexis's relationship with her parents than Daniel's. However, a bunch of you guys said in the episode of Shelve It or Scrap It that this was in, that Daniel's relationship with his mother is explored further in future books in this series, which, as with a lot of romance series, it's like a series of standalones. So I'm definitely excited about exploring that in the future and definitely interested in reading more from Abby Jimenez. Out of all of the 4 stars that I read, I think that this one is probably the one that I'm more on the fence on. This one could have been a 3 or a 4 and it only became a 4-star by a very small margin, and that one is A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. So honestly, I didn't really want to read this going into it. It reminded me a lot of Babel by R.F. Kuang in that I was immediately kind of repelled from the synopsis. I'm not drawn to dark academia. I find a lot of things like that overly pretentious, which honestly is part of the draw of dark academia, but it's something that isn't for me. And this one is following a young woman who is an architecture student at a university, and she wins a competition to redesign the home of her favorite author, who has passed away pretty recently, but he was the author of an iconic book of fairy tales, and he had one specific fairy tale, I think, was it called Angarad, that he was the most known for. So our main character, who I think is called Effie, jumps at the chance to visit this home, have a hand in like redesigning it, but also get to know her favorite author like on a more intimate level through the things that he's left behind and the place that he lived. And when she's there, she meets like a stuffy, uptight English lit student who has been sent there to read through the author's like private writings to start to compile his life story. And while they're both kind of exploring this crumbling manor, they find out some things about this author that they perhaps never wanted to know. So there are reasons that I loved this and things about it that I really didn't like. My favorite thing about this was the atmosphere, because this mainly takes place in a sleepy seaside town, specifically with this house being on the end of a cliff in the middle of nowhere. And the atmosphere created this house, I feel, really permeates the novel. The house is crumbling, it's waterlogged, and when I say waterlogged, I mean it's literally saturated. Like there's water running down the walls, it smells musty, it's moldy. I honestly, logistically do not know how it's still standing, and that was a question that I had repeatedly through reading this novel. I'm assuming that I'm supposed to just kind of suspend my disbelief in that regard, because obviously if you have like soaking wet floorboards, they're gonna give way. But this house is literally drenched in water and there are people living inside it. And every time our main character entered this house, I honestly felt a little bit sick, which I really feel helped to build the atmosphere and make the reader feel the way they were supposed to when they're coming in contact with not necessarily this author, but the environment that he surrounded himself in. Now, something that I didn't love about this is that it is fantastical. And I mean, obviously going into it, I knew that it was a fantasy story, but when I actually started the book, I felt like it really didn't need to be, and it actually would have been a lot more poignant if it hadn't, because this book really focuses on abuse, specifically abusive men and like powerful men abusing women, and that is a theme that runs constantly like throughout the course of this book. And I feel like given the atmosphere, given the nature of like the main topics, and the fact that like there's no real need for magic in this world, I just feel like it would have been one, more poignant and more powerful if we hadn't have had this extra element of it actually being fantastical. And also I just felt like the fantasy was really out of place and unnecessary, because this reads like it is set in like a period in our history. It honestly feels like the UK in like around, I would say, the 1940s, the 1950s. Like, they don't have cell phones and stuff, but they smoke cigarettes, which is a really weird addition to a fantasy world in my opinion. And they also have other bits of like technology and electronics like telephones. So it does feel like this could have been set in our real world. And honestly, I feel like one of the only reasons why this is fantastical is so that the author can take liberties with the like time period and the setting, and it doesn't have to actually be historically accurate. Because aside from one thing that happens right at the very end that leaves us on a note to go into a sequel, which is, I mean, it's fine that there is going to be a sequel, but I also don't think that it needs one, because the core mystery is like wrapped up in this novel. There's no real need for this to actually be fantasy, and it could have been exactly the same, just instead of fantastical things actually happening in the very few instances that they did, it could have been more metaphorical and still really highlighted the key topics of this book. Another reason why my thoughts are pretty mixed on this is because while I did really love the atmosphere, I realized at some point that the only parts of this I were enjoying were the parts that were set at this author's house and in the area where the author lived, which is fine because it is the majority of this book. But I didn't love the beginning portion. Like, it took a while for me to get interested, like in the portions where our characters are at university and they haven't arrived at this house yet. And then afterwards, when they kind of wrap everything up that's going on, and it's once again, there's like a very small portion of it, maybe 2 chapters that aren't set at this house, I was just not super into it. So I do feel like the atmosphere was on point. I feel like it really gives you those like eerie, haunting horror vibes. I just feel like there's a lot of ways that this could have been executed as a stronger book, and I definitely feel like I would have enjoyed this, potentially even given it 5 stars, had it been a horror and not a fantasy. Because the thing with horror as well actually is that you don't have to explain away everything. Like, they can be ambiguously fantastical. So I feel like marketing this as a horror would actually have given people a much better expectation of what this book actually was, and I feel like that is a genre that this book better fits into. I then read the first book for this era of catch-up book club, which was Malice by John Gwynne, and I love this one as well and gave it 4 stars. This one is a adult epic high fantasy series that is set in a world where there was previously a war between men and giants. We start this novel in a era of peacetime, and we are introduced to a bunch of characters that are going to be significant players in this story. And book 1 is really just setting the scene, so I actually cannot really tell you what the plot of this series is, because this reminded me a little bit of Game of Thrones, not just in the fact that it has a lot of similar elements to Game of Thrones, but if you have read the Game of Thrones series or seen the TV show, you will know that the plot of Game of Thrones does not start until the beginning of the 2nd book or the 2nd season. The first bit is just kind of establishing you in the world and getting you acquainted with everybody who is going to play a big part in the story. And that is pretty much what Malice did. So speaking of things like Game of Thrones, something that I noticed immediately going into this is that it had a lot of similarities to things like Wheel of Time, Game of Thrones, The First Law Universe by Joe Abercrombie, which are all adult fantasy series that are set in, I guess, a rough approximation of the UK or this like general area of the world, and they draw of course on all of the same folklore, mythology and history that was prevalent and originated in this area of the world. So that obviously extends into Europe a little bit as well, especially when we were talking about things like Nords and Vikings, which also play a part in British history and so also influence the origins or the stories that these books are drawing on in their creation. Honestly, in terms of setting, this reminded me a lot of like Skyrim, which in case you guys don't know is a chapter of the Elder Scrolls. It is a video game that once again is set in the same kind of world, drawing on the same time period and the same folk tales. We are following predominantly a young boy who is the son of a blacksmith from the age of, I'm pretty sure he's 14 to 16 at the end of this book. His perspective is pretty much every other chapter of this one, so for this first book at least, he's definitely our central focus, but we are also following a bunch of other characters, some from the same area as him, like his sister, and some people from a little bit further afield. Like we have the first man of the prince of a different kingdom. We have like mercenary type characters, and it reminds me a lot in that way of things like Stormlight and also I guess Wheel of Time, where we have all of these people scattered around. So for the first book, you don't really understand their relevance to the story, but as the series progresses, like everything will come together and you'll understand the role that everyone has to play within the whole. So this was a 4-star for me. I enjoyed it. The reason why I didn't rate it any higher, I guess, is because I didn't feel like it was unique. It had a lot of elements that I really liked. You can compare our main character of Corbin to characters like Fitz from the Farseer trilogy. He has that kind of lovable quality to him where he has started at a little bit of a disadvantage in life in that he's constantly bullied throughout this book, even though he didn't start off at like a financial disadvantage like, for example, Fitz did, but he's constantly facing hardship and trials and tribulations and having to work through them. And because we follow him from a little bit of a younger age as he's growing into being a man, and this does actually contain his training to become a man in this society, you kind of become endeared to him quite quickly. Something that I also really appreciate about books like this is when you follow characters, you kind of, I think going into a series like this, I always assume, because of how fantasy has conditioned me to assume, that I'm always going to be following the good guys. Now obviously in recent years I've read some more adult fantasy and some more grimdark, but I feel like I always go in with that wholesome assumption that we're going to be following the good guys. So I actually really love it when it turns out that you think everyone's good to start off with, but maybe throughout the course of a novel they're not, and you're going to be following different facets of what is eventually going to be like the main struggle, the main battle of this book. I guess the plot overall, I'm assuming, is going to be based on a war between light and dark, because isn't it always? There is a prophecy in this world that there is like going to be a good side and a bad side of this war. Everybody thinks that they're choosing the good side, but are they being influenced by the bad side? Who knows? There are going to be two pivotal figures in this battle, one for light, one for dark, which I feel like is where the main Wheel of Time influences come into this series, although that is like a theme that is very common in pretty much all fantasy series to some degree. So yeah, it was definitely a strong start. The reason why it was kind of like a middle of the road 4-star for me though is that obviously this is nothing that I haven't read before. I do personally love it though where we're introduced into a fantasy series at a state of peace where nothing is really happening, so you get to know the characters in this peacetime where nothing of any note is really going on, and then it makes it more impactful and dramatic when bad things start happening later, or you see like the destruction of the life that they've always known, or the destruction of like influential locations in this world before like we actually get into the plot of this series, which I think is going to really kick off in book 2. Another one that is a contender for my favorite of the month is The Deal by Elle Kennedy. I truly did not know that I was going to love this, and I had a great time. So this one is the first book in the Off-Campus series, which is a very popular new adult college romance series from like 2015. I think this one was published. So I knew like with Abby Jimenez that this was incredibly well loved, but because of how long ago it was published now, I didn't know whether it would hold up or whether I would have enjoyed it more if I'd have read it like years ago. So this one is following a young girl in college called Hannah who has a crush on a football player, but do not be fooled, this is not a football romance, this is indeed a hockey romance, because our love interest in here is Garrett, who is one of the star players of the hockey team, and he is like a legacy player, I guess. I don't know, I don't watch sports, so I don't know what they're called, but essentially his father's a famous hockey player and he's really been pushed into playing hockey, but I guess like the benefit, like the plus side, is that he actually enjoys it. So while he doesn't love how involved in the hockey side of his life his father has been, he actually does really enjoy the sport. So these two end up fake dating when Garrett starts failing a class, and he desperately needs Hannah to tutor him because she's one of the only people who did well in this class. So he notices that she has a crush on this football player, and he's like, okay, I know this guy, I know that he only really wants girls that he has to like work for a little bit, and right now you're off the radar, nobody knows who you are, so if you tutor me we can kind of fake date, be seen around, go to parties together, so you can be put on this guy's radar, and then like when he notices you, then you can go ahead, like flirt with him, see if you can make a thing happen. So that is kind of the setup, but obviously as we know this is a romance, so as Hannah and Garrett progress down this path, they end up liking each other a little bit more than they originally anticipated. anticipated. I really enjoyed this. It was very reminiscent to me of like new adult romances of the era, but it's not anything like Penelope Douglas and Colleen Hoover, which are authors that I do enjoy because I find them incredibly entertaining, but they do have a lot of like problematic and toxic elements, which I really don't think was present in the deal. I honestly went into this expecting to have to look at least one problematic thing that went on, and honestly I don't think that it was too bad. I think it did a really good job, especially because the main thing that Hannah has to overcome in here is that she was sexually assaulted at a party when she was 15. She was drugged and she was raped, and this is something that has really put a block on her romantic relationships because she just doesn't feel like she can trust people and open up, and she's incredibly uncomfortable in intimate scenarios, which is something that Gara also helps her to work through, while she helps him to work through this complicated relationship he has with Hockey and his father, given that his father is actually an abusive man. So not only did I think that this was generally non-problematic, I felt like it dealt with sensitive topics really well, which is not what I expected from like a new adult romance from 2015. Another 4-star read was, I mean, they're all 4 stars apart from one, and the next one that's coming up is the 3-star, and you know what, I even enjoyed that one. But another 4-star read was Godkiller by Hannah Kana, which is the first book in, I think this series is called the Fallen God series. I read 2 like God books. Well, all of the fantasy I read was about gods, but I read 2 series that have God in the title. I think that this one's the Fallen God series, but this is one that I have been anticipating for quite some time finally picking up, and this one was one of my Patreon picks, which is why I ended up finally getting around to it. But I also buddy read this with Aaron from Booked and Busy. So this one is a adult fantasy story set in a world where there used to be gods as like part of their regular society. There are all different kinds of gods, like for all different things. Like we actually follow one in here who is a god of white lies, but there's gods of rivers, there's gods of fire that we're introduced to like very early on in this book. And a few years, like a handful of years before the start of this story, there was a war which resulted in the king banning the worship of gods. So he closed off one city of this world where worship was especially prevalent, where there are a lot of god shrines, and he banned people from being able to visit there. However, there are pilgrimages, like secret illegal pilgrimages that head into the city every so often, because people do, like, obviously the beliefs were stripped from them, but that doesn't stop them from believing. So regularly people do secretly slip into the city to give tribute. So in this one we're following 4 main characters if you include the god as one, but 3 like human characters, 1 god. Our first one that we're introduced to is a Godkiller. Now these used to be kind of like secret mercenaries, but since the world has changed, since the king has outlawed the worship of gods, they are now all in the employ of the king. And our Godkiller Kissin actually has a backstory that makes her really hate gods in general, so this profession is perfect for her. We also follow a little girl, I think she's like 12 or 13, and she has a god problem because she is bound to a god of white lies. So when she hears that the Godkiller's in town, she goes to Kissin and asks for her help because the god is bound to her, which is something that isn't supposed to happen. Like, gods should only be bound to shrines. So Kissin reluctantly agrees to take this little girl and the god that's bound to her to this forbidden city to see if they can find out a way to separate the girl and the god, because essentially if they're pulled too far apart from each other, which is like a matter of like I think 20 feet or something, then it's incredibly painful for both of them. So the thought is that like if they were separated for any reason, that they would die, and obviously like they both want to live their own lives independent of each other. And our final main character is a retired knight who is very close to the king. However, when the king outlawed the worship of gods, Elo didn't really agree with that, though he respected the reasons for his friend's choice, and so he retired and he set up a life for himself as a baker. However, one day the king approaches him and asks him to head into this forbidden city on a quest to save the king's life before it is too late, and being one of the king's closest friends and previously a loyal knight, Elo cannot help but agree. So as all of these people make their way to the city, their paths eventually converge and things turn out not to be entirely as they seem. So my absolute favorite things about this one all go hand in hand, and that is the atmosphere, the world building, and the writing. They all combine to create this like luscious, rich world where the atmosphere is like a physical presence. This is not a gothic novel, but I would compare it to gothic novels in something that you can feel the atmosphere of this book. Like, it feels thick and heavy and present as our characters maneuver this world, especially in the early stages, as we are getting to know the influence of the gods on this world, like why everything's happened and played out the way that it had. And I think that the imagining of the gods and their role in this society and their individual quirks was masterful. I actually really liked the discussions on religion in here and the way that it applies to this world, but also in a way that you can apply to like our real world religions, both modern and historical. And that element of this I thought was done perfectly, especially considering the page count. This is 288 pages, so very short. And I wouldn't say that the book is overly dense, but I would say that it is dense in comparison to the page count. Now, word count is not going to be that small because the text in here is quite tiny. So I feel like you get a lot of words per page in this one, but I still feel like the amount of world building that Hannah Keenan managed to cram into here with such a short page count was very impressive, especially because you don't have those massive dumps of exposition. Like, the world building is being done while the story is progressing, but it doesn't feel like it's moving too fast. Like, I don't feel like I don't understand anything. I don't feel confused. I don't feel like I'm lacking attachment to character because we're focusing on world building instead of character development. Like, everything is being done at the same time, and it worked so well. Like, I couldn't even tell you how Hannah Keenan did it, because I love me a long book. I love like a bunch of exposition. I love long, slow moments with characters where nothing's really happening. And despite this being relatively a very short book, really, in compared to a lot of adult fantasy, I don't really feel like it was lacking in any of those regards. The only thing that I didn't love about this, honestly, was the plot and the characters to some degree. Like, I could have been more emotionally invested in them. I don't think that they lacked dimension. I feel like they're very three-dimensional, but I don't feel like I was attached to them as I could be, which was potentially a result of the page count. And the plot was good, very good actually, but it didn't blow my mind, and that's why it's a 4-star, honestly, and not a 5. There was so much that this did perfectly and I adored, but there were other areas that were still very strong, but just not like the best way that I've seen them executed. My 1 3-star read of the month was Ruthless by Sarah Shepherd. So despite this being my lowest rated book of the month, it's not like I didn't enjoy it, because this one is book 10, I think, in the Pretty Little Liars series. So as you can tell, like, I'm quite a bit of the way through. So overall, I am really enjoying this one. But this one, of course, is a young adult mystery series following a group of girls whose friend went missing, and their friendship group kind of splits apart after that because the girl that went missing was the glue that was holding them together, up until about a year to 18 months after her disappearance, where they start to receive anonymous threatening text messages from somebody who signs the texts A, which could stand for anonymous, or it could stand for Allison, the name of the friend that has disappeared. So now that we are 10 books deep into this series, we are on the 3rd story arc, but we've also had a little bit of a time jump and a readjustment of what's going on in this series, because after book 8, it was supposed to be done, but it was picked up and there was another 8 books released. So I think at this point, the books after book 8 are not quite as strong as the first 8. However, I do still find them to be very entertaining. I think something that I have an issue with at this stage in the series is that books 1 to 8 were all around like 275 pages. Books 9 and 10 have come in at around like 50 pages longer than that, but I actually feel like they contain less content. Like, they're just constantly dancing around things that have happened in the past that nobody wants to talk about. I do feel like this one progressed the story a little bit more, and this actually felt more like the first book in the arc than the first book, book 9, did. And I feel like at the end of this one, we now feel like we're finally going to be getting somewhere, and coincidentally book 11 is also around 275 pages, so we've dropped the page count a little bit there as well. So yeah, not the strongest, not the most entertaining. It's not as problematic as it was in the beginning as well, because times have changed. Like, this is about 5 years, I think, after the publication of the first book, so we don't have our main teenage characters like casually smoking anymore. We do still have a lot of like problematic relationships with older men, although I feel like they are actually portrayed to be more problematic in these later installments than they were earlier on. And we do still continue on themes of things like slut shaming shaming and fat shaming, but overall, like, I think it has eased up a little bit on that, but it's still like wild and dramatic enough to be entertaining to me. So I still had a really good time with this one. It's just definitely not one of the stronger books in the series. And then the final book that I read in the month was a surprise to me. I didn't think I was going to enjoy this one for multiple reasons, but that is The Deer and the Dragon by Piper C.J. So this one is the first book in the No Other Gods series, and it is an urban fantasy about an author who has been seeing what she thinks are hallucinations her entire life. It started off with this like fox that became her best friend when she was a kid that didn't really exist, and in her adult life it's manifested into this man that she has a romantic relationship with, but she doesn't think he's real. She thinks insanity runs on the maternal line of her family. So quite early on in this book, she ends up having a near-death experience where she is saved by what appears to be a supernatural creature, and she realizes that all of these hallucinations that she's been having throughout her life are actually potentially real, and that she can actually see beyond the veil into a world of gods and also monsters. So as you can tell, this sounds like a very typical kind of setup for something like a paranormal romance or like an urban fantasy series, which typically are not genres that I really enjoy. However, while this does have a lot of the same themes and a lot of the same tropes as like the paranormal and urban fantasy genre, it's also written in a little bit of a different style. Like, it breaks outside the formula and the conventions of those genre, which is why I actually enjoyed this one, because I don't have any issue with like, this isn't vampires, this is like gods, angels and demons, that kind of thing. But I don't have any issues with things like vampires or like demons or mythological creatures being in a real world kind of setting. It's more the formulaic nature and the repetitive nature and the consistent tropes executed in similar ways I'm really tired of in paranormal and urban fantasy that was done a little bit differently in here. Now, honestly, on top of the fact that I didn't think I was going to enjoy the urban fantasy lean to this, I haven't heard the best things about Piper C.J. So I went into this with a lot of trepidation, and I was surprised when I was just so absorbed in this story. The one thing that I didn't really like about it is the main character. I find her to be incredibly obnoxious and self-centered. She does have this typical like badass attitude that is very common in heroines of this genre. Our main character of this one, Marlowe, is an author. She was previously a sex worker. She made a bunch of money, and then she started writing novels where each installment in this series is about a different pantheon of gods, which blows her mind even more when she finds out that all of these pantheons are actually real. And she has this very much like don't give a fuck attitude, and I felt like the fact that we were following a fantasy author with a don't give a fuck attitude was a little bit too self-insert and a little bit too meta for my tastes. But aside from that, the romance is not extremely prevalent in this first book, because the main mystery that we're trying to solve is what has actually happened to the love interest. Because with our main character Marlowe not believing that he actually exists, she's accidentally banished him and has to go on a quest along with a nymph-like creature who is introducing her to this new world that she now has access to and believes is real, to find the man that she's in love with and bring him back from the place where she's banished him to. This one does talk about real world religion a lot as well, including a lot of discussions that I would say are from like an atheist standpoint. And our main character, and I also believe Piper C.J. herself, also comes from a background of a strict or somewhat strict religious household, which in this book manifests as abuse as well. So if you are potentially somebody who is religious, I am not, so I had no issues with these topics, but if you are religious, especially Christian, although I would say religious in any way, then just be aware of that if you're wanting to pick this up, because it does challenge a lot of religious beliefs in a lot of ways at a lot of points throughout this book, as well as including like biblical creatures as characters in here alongside like Greek, Roman, Norse gods as well. Despite not enjoying the character, despite not really getting a lot of time with the romance, I just really enjoyed the setting of this, and I found it to be very absorbing, much more absorbing than I anticipated going into it. I enjoyed the plot. It was a really good time. Overall, 4 stars, really enjoyed it, and I was actually really sad when this one was over, and I'm very excited because the sequel is actually released in February. At this point, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get to it in February, but while I have no interest at this point in reading Piper C.J.'s other series, series, which is called The Night and Its Moon. I am definitely intending to carry on with this one and potentially keeping an eye on what Piper CJ comes out with in the future. So my battery is flashing red at me. Honestly, the fact that my camera battery gave up on me at that exact moment is quite impressive, I have to admit. But there have been so many obstacles in me filming this video that it is a wonder that we managed to make it to this point without anything actually catastrophic happening or me having a complete breakdown. But we pretty much made it to the end. If you saw Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood in the thumbnail or in the stack that I initially held up at the beginning of this video, I'm sorry, I read it in February. It was my first book for February and my first 5-star of the year actually, so you have that to look forward to. And this will of course be in a vlog coming soon, as well as in my February wrap up. But just in case you were excited about my thoughts on this particular book, it wasn't supposed to be in this video. But these are the 7 books that were supposed to be in this video that I read and enjoyed in January. They're all blue as well. Even Part of Your World, which looks aggressively yellow, is half blue and half yellow on the front cover. And Malice, while that is like almost a grey, is also an icy blue. The Deal by Elle Kennedy, you could argue it's turquoise. I personally would say it's more of a mint green. But generally, everything that I read was pretty on theme color-wise. Maybe I should just read blue books from now on. Maybe that's the secret to eternal 4-star reads. But down in my comments, let me know if you read any of these and what you thought of them. Also, let me know what your favorite book from January was. I honestly couldn't pick one. Genuinely, a lot of them had really strong points. Like, I think that A Study of Drowning had the best atmosphere in terms of like the eeriness of it, but definitely wasn't my favorite. This one probably had the best writing, I would say, as well as really good world building. This one had the most amount of promise, I think, where I feel like there's just better things to come. This one was like really good. Oh no, it's like both sides are blue. So yeah, that is also a blue book. This one was probably the most consistently good. Like, my feelings were very consistent about this one throughout. This one I was probably the most invested in, especially when it comes to romantic relationships. This one I think I was the most absorbed in while I was reading it. Only good things this month, really. But if you guys would like to let me know you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me like a deer or a stag emoji for The Deer and the Dragon by Piper CJ. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and also my Patreon if you would like to join me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye. You okay, Breezy? We done now?
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.